So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our online series, New Energy Conversations with Early Career Energy Researchers. My name is Megan Litweiler, and I'm the Manager for Academic Initiatives at the Irving Institute for Energy and Society here at Dartmouth College. And this series is now in its third year, and our goal with this is to give early career energy and climate scholars from around the country and around the world a platform to share their research. And it's also a great way that we can all learn about some really interesting emerging topics in energy, climate, and society. Now, today we have a great talk to finish off our winter season of New Energy from Vivek Shastry from the University of Texas, Austin, who we will meet in just a minute. And then we'll be back in April with a new series of great talks for spring. So at the end of the presentation today, we'll have a chance for you all to ask some questions of the speaker, so please feel free to enter your questions using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen at any time during the talk. And so now I am delighted to introduce Professor Mark Laser, who is here to moderate this session and introduce our speaker. So Dr. Laser is an associate professor of engineering at Dartmouth College, and he's an expert in many areas, including biomass conservation, sustainable energy and development, process design and evaluation, integrated food and energy systems, and life cycle assessment. He's also been recognized for his excellence in teaching by the Thayer School of Engineering here at Dartmouth. So welcome, Mark. I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Vivek, who is such a young age, already doing really impressive work. He's a PhD candidate at UT Austin, and his research has been focusing really on global energy poverty, thinking about transition dynamics here in the US and elsewhere, and also distributed energy, and which is his focus today, and especially thinking about policy dimensions of this topic. I'm also going to confess right out of the gate that this is outside of my area of expertise, so I look forward to learning with everyone today. So I think I'm going to pass the baton to Vivek and enjoy listening to his talk.
Well, thank you so much, Mark and Megan, for the introduction and for inviting me to present my research on this platform. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Much of my research and the work I will present today is influenced from my time traveling across rural India, working with communities and grassroots stakeholders to implement clean energy solutions for healthcare, for education, and livelihoods. So today, through this research, I want to provide a voice to those communities on what it means to use solar-powered applications for productive uses in rural parts of the world. And women in particular are leading these rural energy transitions in many developing countries. And today happens to be a special day to have the opportunity to share their stories. So very happy International Women's Day to all of them. And so let me begin by setting the broad context for undertaking this study, right? So energy is often regarded as a golden thread that underpins and enables many other development objectives. So in the figure on the left, a review of current literature shows how energy is a strong enabler of other sustainable development goals on good health, on gender equity, on economic growth, among others. So this doesn't come as a surprise to many of you watching today. And the graph on the right shows that over 750 million people today, now mostly concentrated in Africa, still lack access to any electricity. And more than that, recent research suggests that even for the millions that have received basic electricity access recently, the level of access is really insufficient to support much social development. So this kind of leads me to two contrasting approaches for delivering energy access, electricity access, right? So for a long time, practitioners and governments have followed a supply-driven approach, where the focus is typically on extending the grid infrastructure or small solar panels to provide basic level of access, often restricted to lighting, to mobile charging, to small rechargeable appliances. So these efforts have really found to produce only mild to no development benefits for the households. For example, there may be a small health benefit for households from avoided use of kerosene for lighting. Now, over the past few years, there has been really a growing call for shifting the paradigm of providing electricity access to a more demand-driven approach. So here the focus would be on understanding what services the household is lacking, and then using electricity access as a means to enable those services, right? So for example, this could mean electrification of nearby health facilities or powering a small computer that the household can use to provide services and then generate an income. So while this approach stands to produce more development benefits, it is more complex to implement and requires collaboration from multiple stakeholders, such as financing organizations, capacity building organizations, market building institutions, etc. So together, these constellation of stakeholders are referred to as the enabling environment or the ecosystem. So the hope is that these targeted programs build up some resilience capacity amongst households to withstand future shocks and avoid sliding back into abject poverty. I'll focus this talk on India, and particularly those individuals who are engaged in self-employment as a key source of their income. So 51% of Indians' working population are engaged in self-employment. And the average income of those who are self-employed is really only 44% of the minimum wage as defined by the government of India. So the sector is already under stress. Further, the average income of men in the self-employed sector is 2.5 times higher than that of women. So there is already a significant gender gap. And finally, a substantial portion of non-agricultural enterprises reported electricity as a key constraint, one of their key constraints for growth, which really affects business productivity in an already stressed sector. So this lack of reliable electricity and other sort of physical and market infrastructure at the village level leads to a centralization of livelihood opportunities to towns and cities, which kind of deprives those at the last mile of the potential value addition benefits that might have accrued were they able to offer these services at a more decentralized level. So to address these gaps, the emerging frontier of innovation is in efficiently mechanizing every part of the rural value chains across different livelihoods, powering them through solar energy, and then making them accessible to entrepreneurs through appropriate financing and ownership models, right? So the figure here shows a few examples of clean energy livelihood products across different sectors such as textiles, agriculture, animal husbandry, food processing, etc. And so the research on productive uses of DRE or decentralized renewable energy is an emerging field. And many gaps remain in literature, right? So the chief among them is the lack of gender disaggregated data that can aid the design of more inclusive clean energy programs. There's also a need to better understand how the composition and structure of the enabling environment impacts the diffusion of these programs. And specifically with regard to clean energy livelihood interventions, there is a dearth of knowledge on the non-financial qualitative impacts, such as time savings, reduction in drudgery, work flexibility, and so on. So I address these gaps in two parts, before and after entrepreneurs adopt these products, right? So using a gender lens throughout, in part one, I asked two questions related to how an individual accesses these technologies. So how can the structure of the enabling environment influence more gender inclusive clean energy livelihood adoption? And how does the entrepreneur's gender affect their decision-making during different phases of the clean energy adoption process? And in the second part, I asked two questions related to how it impacts these individuals. Specifically, what are the gender disaggregated impacts of clean energy livelihood adoption from a personal level to an ecosystem level? And then through what mechanisms do these interventions contribute towards building livelihood resilience? And so to enable a systematic way to gather data and answer these questions, I use a series of theoretical frameworks, starting very broadly with the concept of empowerment, right? So to apply a gender lens to all of these questions, I turn to the social economist Naila Kabir's work on women's empowerment. So Kabir provides a three-dimensional framework for understanding empowerment. The first is resources, which is access to financial, human, or social resources. The second is agency, which is really about the process of decision-making and other forms of negotiation. And then the third is achievements, which focuses more on well-beings. Now, so this is a framework that's been widely applied in different fields, such as land rights, political participation, and agriculture, to name a few. But there's really weak guidance on how to use this framework for energy and gender and development linkages. So what I do here is devise a way of using additional theories to help gather data across these different categories. Right? So I rely on the concept of enabling environments to study resources, domestication theories to study agency, and then a combination of livelihood resilience and a multi-level impact framework to study achievements. And each of these theories correspond closely to the research questions I outlined earlier. So the enabling environment is sort of an all-encompassing term that represents the confluence of stakeholders and actions that make it possible for an end user to purchase and successfully utilize these technologies, right? So practitioners conceptualize the enabling environment as broadly consisting of 5 components, which is flexible financing, skill development, technology innovation, service provision, and infrastructure, which sort of includes market linkages and partnership with other organizations, and then policy and regulation. But in the study of empowerment, it's also necessary to distinguish the market and non-market factors. For example, the non-market enabling environment can further be separated into 3 levels, looking at the personal, household, or society. And some of these factors are listed in the figure here, and I'll dive deeper into them as I present the results. And domestication is really a concept related to the sociology of technology. It's been used to describe how individuals acquire and adapt technologies, new technologies in their lives. It really defines 4 distinct phases of the domestication process involving appropriation, which is who decides, how a technology is acquired, objectification, which is kind of the decision on where the technology gets located or financed and located in the household, incorporation, which is who gets to use it and how it gets utilized. And then finally, conversion, which is more around who talks about this to other people outside. So this framework sort of helps me break down the gendered aspects of decision-making along different points in the adoption process. And over the past few decades, the primary use of small-scale energy technologies have been for providing basic household access, as I mentioned, and clean cooking. So accordingly, the research on the impact of these technologies have largely been restricted to household-level analysis. And so the potential of clean energy livelihoods, however, go beyond the level of the entrepreneur's household. It's spilling over to employees and customers and other stakeholders in the ecosystem. So this is a framework that I borrow from the field of health behavior, where individuals are often viewed as embedded in larger systems. And so I've adapted this framework to discern the impact of clean energy livelihoods at the level of the entrepreneur, all the way up to the other stakeholders in the ecosystem. And finally, practitioners kind of state often that clean energy livelihoods make entrepreneurs more resilient. So often referring narrowly to the improved business potential. So the concept of livelihood resilience, however, is difficult to measure, and it is an active area of research. So here I rely on the sustainable livelihoods approach developed by DFID researchers in the late 90s. And at the core of this approach are 5 types of livelihood capitals that households possess, accumulate or allocate in order to pursue certain livelihood strategies. And these livelihood capitals can accumulate over time and then serve as a buffer to withstand stresses or shocks to their livelihoods. And I use this framework to conceptualize how different types of impacts can lead to building different forms of resilience. So without getting into too much detail, let me provide an overview of the methodology I used for this study. So clean energy livelihoods are still in an innovation phase, and none of the publicly available data sources contain any relevant data that I can use for this analysis. So I therefore gathered primary data for this study through semi-structured interviews of clean energy adopters in India, livelihood adopters in India. And I'm highly grateful for the support extended by Selco India and Selco Foundation, who are my field partners in this study. And so Selco has been one of the pioneers in developing clean energy livelihoods, and so far implemented more than 10,000 solutions in the past 5 to 6 years, which is very high given the early stage of many of these innovations in this sector. I'll also mention that I'm a former employee of Selco Foundation, which gives me unique access to data and staff and field sites, which would otherwise be harder to get. So I analyzed a sales data set from Selco to develop a sampling strategy. I use this to develop a sampling strategy based on gender and typologies of products and enabling environments. I then conducted semi-structured interviews of a sample of their customers in the state of Karnataka in South India. And then I analyzed these interviews using a two-stage abductive coding strategy, which I can talk more about later on. And this is how I develop my sampling framework, right? So the first level of stratification is in the enabling environment. Enabling environments are stronger or weaker depending on the penetration of sales, and they're more or less diverse based on the different financial institutions that they rely on. So I identified 4 to 5 geographies that represent these 4 types of enabling environments. The second level of stratification is along the livelihood itself. So I selected 5 livelihood products that represent a diversity across sector, across gender roles, market diversity, and scale of adoption. You'll also see some indicative costs here where some of them are relatively less expensive compared to more complex technologies like food processing, which tend to be more expensive. And the third and the most important level of stratification for me is along gender. And so I therefore sought at least half of my interviewees to be female. And so overall, I sought to recruit about 60 interviews with flexibility to account for field realities. And so just quickly, here are some, going back to the slide, here are some photos of the kind of technologies that I refer to. These are blacksmiths who use a small blower that's solar powered to heat the coal. These are machines that are used to roll roti doughs or flatbreads into rotis, sewing machines that are solar powered, various types of food processing machines, and then milking machines in the dairy sector. Okay, so on the left here is a map of Karnataka, which is in South India, where I conducted my field work. And you may recognize here the city of Bangalore, which is where I'm from. And these locations are quite diverse, from the peri-urban areas near Bangalore to the villages deep inside the hills, to villages that are far off along the state borders. So I interviewed a total of 64 entrepreneurs, of which 60% were women. And the higher cost of food processing machines means that they're undersampled in this study since they are relatively new. So without getting into every part of this table, one other thing to note here is all of the entrepreneurs belonged to one of the protected social classes in India, and most of them had not completed 10th grade. So the one thing to note right away is these solutions are already reaching populations that are marginalized along several different dimensions. And all of the blacksmiths, just getting into the gender distribution in my sample, all of the blacksmiths in my study were male, and this was expected as this is a traditionally male-dominated livelihood. And on the other hand, almost all of the roti and roti making and sewing and tailors, sewing machine entrepreneurs I interviewed were female, whereas the distribution was mixed for those who purchased milking machines and food processing machines. And about half of my interviewees financed their products from a microfinance institution called SKDRVP, who facilitate loans with weekly payment options that range from as low as $2 to $3 a week through a self-help group model. And they also facilitate various types of training and exposure, technology exposure visits for their members. A quarter of the respondents paid in cash, whereas the remaining obtained loans from either banks or local credit cooperative societies. And this distribution was kind of similar for the men and women in my sample. Okay, so let me now jump into the results. First, let me highlight how the enabling environment influences the adoption of these products, particularly from a gender perspective. So solar-powered products have conventionally been targeted for unelectrified populations. And on the contrary, most of the respondents in my study already had grid connections. However, about half of them suffered from daily outages, which was one of the key reasons that pushed them towards solar products, which provided much more reliability. And this was a lot more common for those who are on agricultural lines, which tend to provide electricity only for 6 or 7 hours a day for pumping, and for the remaining hours, they usually don't have electricity in the farms. There are also legal considerations of running commercial loads on domestic connections, as one of my respondents, Maunesh, explained. So here he says, I'm operating a single phase supply, so my costs are lower, but he has solar for his chili grinding machine. So he doesn't have to get a 3-phase supply or a commercial line. And if he has to get that, then if he doesn't inform the electricity board, then he gets a penalty, or if he has to apply for it, then he has to pay a lot more for that commercial line. And since he uses all of these machines on solar, he doesn't have to deal with any of those legal implications. And so another point in terms of financing is more fraction of women were engaged in financial activities in my sample compared to men. For example, among 54 married respondents out of the 64 people in my sample, in 92% of the households, the women had taken a loan in the past compared to 63% for men. So this is partly a result of government policies incentivizing new bank accounts for women, and also the provision of loans to women through self-help group movements. So this is an underlying social infrastructure that allowed the enterprise to access financing for women. And so when it comes to accessing and expanding markets, transportation poses a unique challenge for women. So for example, entrepreneurs who started a roti business mentioned that for people come to them, to their place to pick up their orders. And in most cases, they found it difficult to travel routinely outside to sell rotis to hotels or other nearby venues, which then restricts the size of the market that they're able to access. And most of the entrepreneurs did not really need training to use these products or to run a business. So it was pretty minimal or self-explanatory. Often a short post-installation demo was sufficient to get them going. However, new entrepreneurs who started using more technically complex products, such as solar-powered flour mills or spice grinders, they found it difficult to fix any technical issues that arose from routine use. And women especially face this issue, as, for example, Meena, who's another respondent who has a solar-powered tamarind processing machines, mentioned to me. She said, they tried to fix something in their machine. It was, some things got sticky and they got hurt in the process. So these kind of more complex machines need more training and an ecosystem to maintain them, especially for women. So coming to the non-market factors, these also have a significant part in determining how successful the business was. So for example, personal aspirations to run a successful business depend on past life experiences, such as sometimes the early death of a partner, or and more often on whether their business is considered a primary or a secondary source of income. So for example, tailoring was a primary source of income for Renuka, and she overcame a lot of family barriers to actually get her business going. So, here she says, when I used to stitch before, my mother-in-law used to send them off saying, I have to work in the field, and she kind of fully discouraged her work. And so they fought, moved out into a new house, and then she was able to actually pursue her livelihood a lot more than what she used to do, she was able to do before. And so especially when it is a supporting source of income, limited family support can really limit their potential, as in the case of Sheila, another entrepreneur. Both husband and wife are entrepreneurs. The husband runs a shop and a business, and then the wife runs a tailoring store. So here, Nagraj is explaining to me that that our house is not far away and our children have to go to school. So my wife sort of comes here for 3 hours in the morning and then she has to go back, and I don't force her to work much. And so whatever possible is sufficient. So these kind of family dynamics can limit how much an entrepreneur is able to pursue in terms of expanding the business. Right? And many other household factors can restrict business, for example, being in rental properties, or the autonomy to make decisions, or the availability of other family members who can actually support the business. Many of these factors can actually impact how much they're able to take the business forward. And finally, caste is one of the things that affects a lot of activities in India. And so, but for a lot of these livelihoods, I found that caste did not influence most of the livelihoods, except for food-related activities, such as, for example, roti making. So in this case, the entrepreneur's caste can affect the size of the local market they can access. So when coming to domestication and the decision-making process, so what I'm showing here is a Sankey diagram of the roles played by household members in the decision-making process. So from left to right here, we can see the movement in terms of who found out about the product, who decided to purchase it, who financed it, who owns it on paper, who uses it primarily, and then who discusses with others, right? So the way to read this chart, for example, is in most of the cases where the man in the household found out about the product, they alone decided to purchase in most of the cases, whereas in a very small fraction of the cases, the woman was also involved in this decision to purchase, right? So I noticed two distinct pathways in which women are involved in decision making. The first is as entrepreneurs. So when, for example, women are involved in the decision to purchase a product, they went on to finance it and used it in 89% of the cases. So here is, how they decide to finance it, and then they go on to use it. Right? In these cases, women have a lot more agency, as, for example, one of the entrepreneurs mentioned, I do this work and I get to decide, right? So what do the men do? I went and saw it and I decided I should try it, and then I got it, and I've been doing this work since then. So it gives them a lot of agency when they're involved in the decision-making process from early on. And the second type is as enablers. So when women are not involved in decision making, and when the men are primarily or somebody else in the household is making the decisions, even then, in 40% of the cases, they ended up financing these products, right? So because they had access to financial institutions. So in many cases, they act as enablers for someone else to use it. And so this is a function of the way the enabling environment is structured in these geographies, where women have access to financing through self-help groups and microfinancing institutions. So in a different enabling environment, these dynamics may be different, right? So if women don't have access to financing, then the decision-making and ownership may be more skewed towards men. And so using a multi-level impact framework to guide the interview revealed a whole range of nuanced impacts experienced by the entrepreneurs themselves, as well as those in their household and community. So starting from a personal level, the respondents talked not just about income, but also a reduction in drudgery, flexibility for other members of the household to take on work in their absence, the reliability of the technology and the servicing from the enterprise, improvements in productivity, the ability to complete time-sensitive tasks, among other things, right? So, and for many respondents, the reduction in drudgery is not just a minor impact. So for example, consider what Ashwath had to say. He owns a milking machine, a solar-powered milking machine. He says he's been milking manually for the past 10 years, and both of my hands used to feel numb and tired. And he was in a situation where he couldn't lift heavy objects, he couldn't carry water, he couldn't ride his bike. And so that started affecting his other work as well. And in many of these cases, the doctors basically say you either stop doing this work or you figure out, a way of doing it through other devices. And when they don't have access to reliable electricity, they hesitate often to buy electric devices that run on grid electricity. And this is where solar makes a huge difference for them. And similarly, respondents also mentioned about others in their household getting relief from drudgerous work or sharing their infrastructure for themselves to generate an income. Respondents provided employment to other people in their community or provided training for others to use these machines. Customers in the neighborhood gain access to a new service or reduce the effort that they had to put to get that service done. And at an ecosystem level, many respondents acted as champions in their community by growing their networks, by referring other people to consider clean energy solutions, etc. So the most frequently mentioned mentioned impact was reliability. And this is not just the fact that they had electricity when they needed it, but also the reliability with respect to the product itself and the service that was given by Selco, the energy enterprise. And so that reliability, for many gave rise to a confidence that they can take on a lot more work and their means to fulfill those orders would not fail them. And so some of these impacts also varied strongly by gender. For example, half of the women I interviewed noted that they started a new business after buying this product. And in most cases, they were not engaged in any income generating work or worked as daily wage laborers in agriculture fields, often earning less than $2 a day for a full day's work, right? And so similarly, generation of seasonal and long-term employment was also observed mostly for women who are involved in the roti making business, right? So the business was run by them and they hired other women for paid work. So the prevalence of these impacts also vary depending on the type of product we analyze, but perhaps I can come back to this during discussion if needed. And finally, these impacts translate to different forms of resilience, right? So in addition to increases in income, entrepreneurs talked about how the productivity helped them to intensify their livelihood, for example, adding new product lines, or help them to diversify into a new source of income that didn't exist before. Almost all of the respondents discussed ways in which they built up new market linkages or met influential community leaders through their work, which are important ways of building social capital. Another example is how their work changed the level of trust or respect their community members placed in them. And so these are intangible capitals that the entrepreneurs can draw from when they need to. Similarly, these impacts affect human capital in many ways. So the most important one is improvements to their health as a result of reduction in drudgery, which can result in an improvement in overall quality of life. And many respondents were sort of emphatic about how the reliability of these solutions had dramatically increased their self-confidence to take on more work or face financial difficulties, be able to face difficulties in the future. And the fourth piece here is physical capital, meaning investments that many respondents made that were complementary solar products or associated infrastructure, which helped them improve their business. So in fact, it so happened that a third of the respondents that I interviewed already owned more than 2 solar products, and many were inquisitive about other products, right? So this sort of highlights the value that a lot of these communities see in productive use technologies. And so the final contribution of my study is tying all of these strings together to lay out the mechanisms through which these impacts lead to resilience. And this figure is a little busy. For example, starting a new business can not only lead to increased income, but it can also diversify the income streams, right? And similarly, the feeling of independence or getting validation from peers can change the local norms about how neighbors perceive the entrepreneur. The reliability and reducing service time for the customers can help build up self-confidence. Improvements in productivity and cost saving can motivate additional investments in the livelihood. So these are all potential mechanisms through which these impacts translate into various forms of resilience, right? So some overall observations here. Some impacts, for example, like starting a new business, lead to many forms of resilience, right? Social and human capital can accrue from all different levels of impact and then contribute to long-term resilience. For example, let me take the last case here, the case of Hemalata, where she says, we after doing this work, we got to know police officers, bank officials, and doctors, and they were able to do a lot of their routine work a lot faster than what they used to be able to do before, right? And so, especially for women, the growth of self-confidence is particularly important. They didn't know who I was before, and now they start calling me madam, and they ask me for help, and these kind of things really help in building up self-confidence, which is an important form of resilience. And so future research should really test these mechanisms in different enabling environments. So let me conclude here just quickly with a few insights for program design, and I can dive deeper into some of these in questions if necessary. So an underlying social and financial infrastructure is necessary to facilitate inclusive access to a lot of these livelihoods. And without reliable servicing that maintains a lot of these products, many of these impact mechanisms can fail and leave the entrepreneurs worse off. And livelihood value chains are long, and there are many different tasks involved in those value chains, and some of those tasks are more gendered than others. So there's targeted innovation that's needed to address pain points in a value chain. And then, as I explained, there's a need for sort of need-based training and capacity building that may be necessary for new entrepreneurs. And just some insights for program evaluation here. Getting a peek not just at what the income increase was, but really what that income was used for. For example, a lot of my respondents mentioned they opened recurring deposit accounts for their kids, and they paid off other loans through this income, etc. And so these insights can help understand what the real benefits are. And the second point here is, one of the metric that's often used is, what percentage of times did the income increase, but the businesses, especially in rural areas, need not always keep growing traditionally in the way we look at businesses. And there are many aspects where the entrepreneur might say this is sufficient, or there might be aspects that force them to force the business to decline. And then finally, as evident from many of the observations in the study, there are plenty of non-financial reasons why entrepreneurs really valued a lot of these clean energy livelihood products. So evaluations focused on income generation and productivity are likely to undervalue a lot of the perceived benefits, as we saw in the findings. So let me pause there, and thank you so much again for providing a platform to present these findings, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Okay, so I think we're in a position. First of all, thank you, Vivek. That was very interesting and very important work that you're doing. I especially appreciated the fact that you're calling out and showcasing actual human beings, and I thought that was a particularly effective component to your talk. And I also appreciated the focus on livelihood resilience. As we sort of face this climate change mitigation existential crisis that humanity is in, I think that's important for us all to consider. What I'm going to do now is, it seems that we've had one question appear on the Q&A. So folks, if you could please compose your questions, I'd appreciate that. So I think what I'll do, and I actually had 3 questions that we received via email beforehand. I think I'll attend to this Q&A question first. So first of all, thank you to the composer of this question. So the person says, thanks, Vivek, really great presentation. The question is, are all the appliances exclusively solar powered, or do they also have batteries? And are they exclusively off-grid, mini-grid, standalone systems, or grid connected?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Mark, for the remarks, and thank you for the question. Yes. So all of the products most of the products that I've considered here are off-grid standalone solar systems with batteries. However, as I mentioned, most of these respondents also have domestic grid connections at their homes, so they're not off-grid communities, but they do have many issues in terms of reliability of their supply, the legality of whether they can use the connections for some of these purposes, and many health reasons, for example, that motivate them to purchase solar-powered products. However, in some of the more complex technologies, for example, solar-powered flour mills or spice grinding machines, these tend to be larger systems, and they tend to be more sort of sometimes grid connected, inverter-based systems with batteries. So they have the flexibility, in case the entrepreneurs need to use a lot more than the capacity that's been provided, they can then switch over to the grid and then use that additional capacity. And so one thing that I will mention here is a lot of the technology, the livelihood product technology that are associated with these livelihoods, a lot of them went through innovation and testing, right? So many of them were not products that were readily available in the market, which all tend to be AC powered. So there are AC motors that are designed to work with the grid. Whereas to work on solar and to reduce the costs of the overall systems and to make these more efficient, you really need these motors and the technology to be DC, so that you avoid the cost of inverters and so on. So a lot of these products actually, the field partner worked with the technology providers, many local technology providers, to retrofit or redesign roti rolling machines or sewing machines with DC appliances to then be compatible with solar powered standalone solar powered systems.
Wonderful. The person says thank you. Next question is actually two parts. So first part is, I wonder why you chose to use the empowerment framework. Could you talk a bit about your process for choosing this? And then the second piece is, you talked about mechanisms of resilience, but it wasn't clear what resilience meant in this case. Apologies if I missed this, as I joined later. But if you could say something about this, I'd appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for those questions. The first part, could you remind me what the first part was?
Yes, the first question was, I wonder why you chose to use the empowerment framework.
Empowerment framework.
Talk a bit about your process for choosing this.
Right. Yeah. So one of the I don't come from a sociology or a psychology background or a gender studies background. So one of the difficulties that I was having was in sort of understanding how to understand the role of gender across all of these different questions that I was asking. And each of them all of these questions were interrelated, and they all had gendered elements in them, right? So when I was thinking through a lot of these different frameworks, it so happened that the empowerment framework really covered all of the different pieces that I was studying, which is, as I mentioned, what happens before people get access to certain products or services, and then what happens in the process of getting access to those, and then what happens after. Now, these were exactly the kind of dimensions that I was looking at in my study. And so it really lined up neatly. But one of the things was, this is a very popular framework that's been widely used by a number of people. And because of that, it tends to be customized to the field that it is applicable to. And so the part of the effort here is really how do we anchor the elements of that framework in other theories, so that in the future, when we want to replicate these studies in other contexts, we have these theoretical anchors that serve as a common sort of point for different researchers to start from. So that was the humble effort here, was to have a structured theoretical way of approaching this problem, and the empowerment framework really brought all of these together, especially when focusing on gender. And the second question was on resilience mechanisms. So I think, so as I mentioned, resilience many times resilience is talked about in terms of income, right? Hey, these interventions made help the entrepreneur make more money, and the increased financing, the increased cash flow makes them more resilient. Well, that is definitely true, and that is certainly the primary goal of these interventions, is to improve the business productivity and to improve an income. However, resilience is, as I mentioned, it has many other dimensions, and the key ones there are the social and human dimensions, which are often much harder to measure. So, one of the future areas for work, and there is a lot of work happening in this space, is also to be able to measure some of these metrics, right? So how do you measure social capital? How do you measure human capital, so that you can actually track how much more resilient or less resilient the entrepreneurs became? And that's definitely an area for future work. But the point is, when I was talking to a lot of these entrepreneurs, this is sometimes that can get missed in the questionnaires or surveys, right? So the sentiments that the entrepreneurs express, especially the one that stood out to me, was confidence, right? So just having this infrastructure that's reliable, that lets them take on any amount of work in the future, and to know that it'll be there to fulfill those things, that gave them a lot of confidence, in addition to how they were perceived by the community. A lot of people said, I was ashamed to do this work before. I didn't know what people would think when I start making rotis, and then I've started doing this, and I've run a successful business, and now people, in many rural communities, they're small, tightly knit communities, right? And so to going from not a lot of people in my village knew about me, to saying anybody in the village can point to who the roti maker is, right? So you can go to the bus stop or go to a local pharmacy, and then they'll point you to who in the village is doing that business. So that's a lot of social capital for them for future, when they want to start new initiatives or want to go to somebody for help, etc. So these are the different forms, the different mechanisms through which entrepreneurs really build resilience, and I feel there is a lot that needs to be studied. As this work scales up, a lot of philanthropic organizations and government policies. For example, India now has a policy on decentralized renewable energy for livelihood applications. A lot of other philanthropic organizations are investing in this. So as this scales up, there will be a pressure to evaluate a lot of these policies and programs. And the point I'm trying to make here is those evaluations have to go beyond the financial metrics and look at resilience and impacts from a much broader perspective, as it comes out from the stories of many of these entrepreneurs.
Wonderful, thank you. So we have another question regarding caste, and with the comment being that that it's being disincentivized by the government. And so if you could discuss some of the government-led initiatives, and just in general, your comments on the effects of caste.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so this is something going in, I've been doing this fieldwork I've been involved in this work for the past like 6 to 8 years. And I've seen in the past where caste can have an effect on a lot of these electricity related interventions. There were times when it was so bad that when there was a mini grid and there were people from lower castes getting electricity from the same mini grid as people from the upper castes, there were pushback from these communities and so on. So, these were not projects that I was directly involved in, but sort of stories I've heard from other practitioners before. But yes, I mean, very broadly, the almost all of the respondents that I spoke to, especially in Karnataka, which sort of happens to be a more quote unquote developed or progressive states in India, a lot of the entrepreneurs mentioned that caste, does not affect their work in any way, right? So, which is true for tailors, for example. Nobody cares who you're giving your clothes to for tailoring, as long as the fit is right. Nobody cares. The same goes for milking machines and any work in the dairy sector. All of the milk you get, you are supplying in most of the times to the dairy, so it doesn't matter. Again, blacksmiths are, by profession, by historically, their caste has been associated with this work. So again, it doesn't matter there. So where it did matter, and not in a significant way in my sample, but keep in mind that my sample is small and it looks at only one geography. So these dynamics may be different if I look at some other states, So for example, people said, sure, when I asked them, whether caste affects their work, one of the women said, well, I didn't know if I should tell you this because you didn't ask about this, but yes, like people prefer to buy from me because I'm a Lingayat. So Lingayats are in relatively from a higher caste hierarchy, right? So to say. So anybody in that community would be willing to buy from me. Whereas another woman expressed, for example, that one of her friends bought it, and they eat meat in their home, and therefore some of the people from the other castes prefer not to buy rotis from them. So this can then limit the size of the market, right? So this can then affect who they can sell to and who not. Again, not something I noticed in a major way that it derailed somebody's business, but definitely an element that that's definitely on the minds of the people. And the more these types of food related interventions we look at in the future, I have a sense that some of these dynamics might come out.
Wonderful, thank you. And that actually, some of your thoughts might feed into this next question, which is, which appliances/technologies that had a higher uptake than others? And were these influenced by costs or the users? Hopefully
right.
You got that.
Yeah, so thank you for the question again. And as I mentioned in the slide where I talked about my field partners, these are just the 4 that I've taken, 5 categories that I've taken, because these were started they started implementing this in 5 or 6 years back. So there's been a lot more people who have bought these technologies, and this is sort of a continuous innovation process. So there are right now, Selco, for example, they're working on more than 150 different appliances or interventions for livelihoods. Everything from egg incubators to like popped rice making machines and many other things, right? So a lot of these interventions go through an innovation phase where new technologies might need to be developed, new processes might need to be developed, and very often the entrepreneurs and the end users play a very active role in providing feedback on how these technologies are developed and how to make them more efficient. And then they sort of go through this phase where then they get scaled up, right? Which is also a function of building the capacity in the rest of the ecosystem to help these technologies to scale. For example, building the capacity of local agricultural organizations and farmer producer organizations, having them exposed to solar powered millet processing machines or things of that nature. And then building the capacity of financial institutions to be able to finance these products, because these are all not typical lending categories for banks or other institutions, right? So there's a whole lot of ecosystem building that goes on in moving these products from innovation to replication to scale. So long story short, in the products that I've looked at, all the 4 except food processing, they all have a high uptake or a relatively high uptake because they've been in the market for long and people have seen these in other entrepreneurs using these. So there's a lot of peer effects, learning from each other, and therefore there are established financial linkages for these products, and therefore more people access it. Whereas for something like food processing machines, these are more customized, bigger, complex, more newer. There are still sort of technical and other issues to sort out. So we'll see them coming up more in the future.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've got about 4 minutes left by my watch, and I'm hoping that maybe as part of this conclusion, and you touched upon some of this one in your reflections about ecosystems, but what I'm wondering is, it seems like the lens has been a focus on individual entrepreneur livelihood resilience. I'm wondering if you might comment on community effects with respect to resilience.
Sure. So one of the direct ways that I looked at here, community, we can look at it two ways. One is in terms of services. So for a lot of communities, especially those who are living remotely or far off, getting access to a flour mill can be a really tough job. Like they might have to travel for sometimes a couple of hours, spend a lot of money because there isn't public transport in these areas, take their grains to a flour mill far away, and then if there's no electricity there, then they have to wait and then come back and then go again to pick it up, etc. So there's a lot of effort that's involved in some of these somewhat routine tasks, right? These are things that we don't think about on a day-to-day basis. And I can give more examples of this. I talked a lot here about livelihoods, but the same is true for healthcare, right? So if your local health clinic does not have electricity or the ability to operate a lot of the medical equipment, then you're having to go very far off to access basic care. So having these sort of basic infrastructure, both from economic and productive uses, and social infrastructure like healthcare and education, having them function at the local level is a form of building resilience, right? So then you're able to function without having to rely on having to go too far or have consequences because of that. That's one form of resilience. And the second also goes beyond these products itself, right? So it's not just access to a solar powered sewing machine, or I bought this product. It's not about it's less about the product itself, but more about the ecosystem that's around that product, right? So a lot of these individuals also gained access to financing, and they gained access to a new asset, and they built a financial history, which then lets them, or not just them, but they're also their neighbors, borrow for other purposes, because the local banker now knows that, some things like these work and people are paying back, and therefore there is a higher level of financial activity in the local community. And similarly for capacity building and so on. So I would say these are a couple of different forms in which we can look at resilience from a community perspective, and certainly that deserves a closer and a closer look in itself.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think, Megan, I'm gonna ask if you have any last words.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. Vivek, do you have any sort of final words that you'd like to share before we close out?
I mean, just thank you so much for this platform, and for all of you for your questions and this interaction. I think this is a very exciting and impactful space that will certainly grow in the future. And there are some challenges, these things, especially in livelihoods, a lot of these interventions in the sectors are diffuse. So it takes a lot of effort to bring all of these stakeholders together, especially at a global level. So I, invite others to join in this research and implementing these programs and really facilitate these impact for a lot of vulnerable communities across the world. So thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vivek. And thank you so much to Mark for moderating. That was a fantastic talk. And so thank you so much for sharing your research with us today. And thank you for being here, Mark. We really appreciate it. So that concludes our presentation for today. We have, and our winter season of new energy. And so we'll be back in the spring with some new speakers to share starting on April 12th. So we hope to see you there. Keep an eye out for our schedule that will be posted soon. And for any other early career researchers in the energy and climate space, we're hosting our second annual New Energy Summer Summit this July, and applications are open right now. We encourage you to submit an application if you're interested. It's a really great event. It's small, really collaborative, a great way to sort of network with other early career researchers and spark some possible research connections and collaborations. So we encourage you to apply. And we hope to see you again for New Energy. So thank you so much for being here. Again, thank you to our moderator and to our wonderful speaker, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks so much.